So, today I want to talk to you about clothing and thinking about character design. Now, rather than going through and just like I was doing some videos showing you, this is what boots are and this is the structure of pants, something we all have. And unlike things like anatomy, you don't really need me to break those things down. You can look at them, you can see them, go through your own closet. And in fact, there's so many resources out there that'll show you any historical costume you want, like where the pieces come together. What I want to talk to you about is what that clothing means, and so it can help us understand the designs of our concepts and then better be able to capture them in 3D. So I want to introduce you briefly to a very big concept called semiotics. This is a very famous painting. It's by the artist Rene Magritte, and it is called The Treachery of Images. And this translates roughly to, this is not a pipe, because it was not a pipe, it is a painting of a pipe. And the idea that the images don't represent aren't necessarily the things that we see. And when we're making things in 3D, we're not really making real things. We're not making real clothing. We're not making real bridges. We're not making real cars. I've mentioned several times. Perfection isn't our goal in terms of its manufacturing. We're not working with a CAD program here. We're trying to create something that visually looks correct. And sometimes we have to exaggerate to make things look right. For instance, all of these components here, you see a frame, an engine, a steering wheel, a tire, a seat, you immediately think car. But these images, none of these things are a car. And even if you put them all together, it still doesn't make an entire car. A car is a combination of many, many components coming together. And each choice of component is going to decide what kind of car it is. Every one of them is important. And sometimes, if I asked you to list every component that went into making a car, you might actually really struggle after the first 12 or so obvious ones. And the same thing happens with character design, where people think they know how to design a character. It's one of the reasons that in this class I want you to go from a concept. Because really, as you start to try to design a character, you realize how many details you haven't really thought of or worked out. This kind of combination of things that comes together to elegantly create a final product is how we get really great lasting character design. I think about Darth Vader is maybe one of the most infamous villains, recognized pretty much worldwide by moviegoers of all ages. Even if you haven't seen Star Wars, you probably know this is Darth Vader. And the lasting appeal, if you looked at and watched the original trilogy movies in Star Wars, there's not a lot to the character. In fact, in the first Star Wars movie, barely got any lines. It was kind of a second-hand villain. It was not the main villain of the first movie, but we remember this character because the design was really, really effective. And the design is relatively straightforward. It has a lot of things in it, but it shows what's going to happen when you combine a World War II gas mask with a traditional samurai helmet. You essentially get this thing that no one had combined together. And a lot of your character designs you're going to look at are probably a lot of these factors of combining things to make something new together. We want to avoid bland and cliched kind of things. This is one of the issues I think that plagues a lot of the artwork I see coming out of new artists is they want to copy the things they love, and we get copies of copies of copies. In fact, I mean, anime and manga are rife with this kind of archetypes of characters that are nearly interchangeable and identical from series to series in personality and style, and we want to avoid that kind of cliche. I think a great example of really good, interesting character design is like, let's break down Jojo from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure here. We see the whole character iconic in his stance, his proportions, his anatomy, but the details of the clothing tells us a lot about the character. The uniform tells us that he is, despite otherwise his appearances, a Japanese schoolboy. The open coat and jacket shows his rebellious nature. The hat itself is this sort of kind of question of people ask, is it hair and it's just sort of a collar? Is it the hat is sort of frayed at the back and the creator intentionally keeps it sort of ambiguous but still wearing a traditional school's cap, but tucked into it is the little Buddha palm symbol, which denotes both sort of Jojo's spiritual side and his devotion to martial arts, the Buddha palm being a symbol of protection. We also have this heavy chain, which has a strong connotation to the 90s American hip hop. And these belts are Western, like an American Southwestern Native American style thing, which shows again this influx of American culture into this character, which is meant to denote his sort of hooligan and rebellious connection. So we have this school age schoolboy thing juxtaposed with these symbols of American, what was in Japanese associated with rebellious youth. And all of that comes together to give you an impression of who this character is as a person. And that's what makes the design effective. These aren't just details. These are essential parts to understanding who this character is. Edith Head, who is the basis for the character from The Incredibles, Edna Mode, that one right there, once asked, she was one of the pioneers of this entire field of we would call character design costuming now, and really led to our understanding, again, why she's immortalized as Edna Mode is because she's so essential to the history of designing characters. She was the fashion designer who did a lot of the clothing for Audrey Hepburn and all of her movies, and was one of the first people in Hollywood to really make a career out of designing costumes. Now, whole series will tell entire story arcs out of characters. In fact, there's a really great, you should check it out sometime. There's a really great series on Imager, I believe, of talking about Sansa Stark's costuming throughout Game of Thrones, and you can see episode by episode how her character evolves based on just how they dress her. And she said, always dress the character in clothing that is most essential to them. Most essential to them, that you shouldn't add any accessories or details that don't tell you anything. In fact, that's one of the things that's interesting about Edna Mode is the minimalism of her own clothing. It creates a strong focus because it exemplifies that idea of essentialism towards characters. Everything they should wear and do should tell us something about them, and we shouldn't add anything that doesn't. So a good example that we could tell an entire arc in the story is like Shuri from Black Panther. She starts not only as like the punk kid sister of T'Challa, but we can see her look with the necklace, the hair, and sort of a childish, these two little spheres on her head of hair. I don't want to call this, but like very childish. But also her jacket and look exemplifies an idea of a rebellious Western teenager. Again, she's smart alecky and she can be a little bit bratty. Then we see her in her own traditional garb. She shows and displays discomfort because she's more comfortable in this idea of the future of technology, but also of the future of Wakanda. And she is seen here mentioning several times how uncomfortable she is in her traditional garb as well as in her traditional roles. The arc of the character at the end is to integrate the two sides into the self. We see the adoption of some of the elements of her traditional garb, some of the elements of her more youthful, rebellious outside garb, as well as the induction of her own technology, and her hair making something of a compromise between the two styles. Because at the end of this story, she is meant to be a warrior as she has managed to securely ingrain her two sides together. This was a good movie. There's a great YouTube video by the costume designer of this film as she describes the way she's integrated various traditional African garb into creating the different tribes of Wakanda. Fascinating stuff, but you could see an entire character arc can be laid out for us in just clothing. We want to look at, like, all good character design and character clothing is taking things and exaggerate. Accuracy is rarely what we're looking for. Even in like games that are trying to be accurate, they're always exaggerating and pushing things further to make them more visually interesting. How can you make something traditional and normal stand out? So for instance, on the left here is a very accurate recreation of a knight's medieval armor. And it's interesting. It's visually interesting to say the least. However, this concept by Max Yenin on the right is far more compelling and memorable. The way it integrates and adapts other costuming details that can give you some more information about who this character is. The character on the left, I know nothing about other than Knight. The character on the right, I feel like I have a better sense of the personality of what that character would be like. Maybe they're an adversary for my opponent, and they represent some sort of noble knight that sees themselves as above everyone else and never raises his visor. Like, these are details I can get from this that I can't get from the one on the left. Purely by adding details, combining ideas like armor and traditional costuming that you might find in a court. Remember, we're not looking for things that are obvious and repeated. If you're going to make a cast of characters, make them different and memorably so. This is a big mistake I see people make when they do a lot of casting, and it's not just series, it's human beings too, where you don't surround yourself with people who are different enough than you or have different enough views of you. It makes it as dull as a series about characters that pretty much all look identical and look the same, which is not what we're trying to do in character art. We're trying to create something different. We're trying to create a different perspective for every major character and a different viewpoint. So when you're doing your own characters, ask, how are they different from the other characters? How do they stand apart even as they are part of the same world? Remember, it's all about telling a story through clothing. Ask yourself questions about the character by looking at the design. Infer what you think is going on there. One of my favorite examples of all this is Luke Skywalker from the original Star Wars series. I know 2 Star Wars mentions in here, but this is a great example of over 3 movies. You can see a journey of this character. Goes from the pure white of the innocent farm boy on the desert of Tatooine, gets into the moral ambiguity as he's dressed primarily in gray in Empire Strikes Back as he learns the truth of his own parentage. And then we see this completely black-clad version of him, gloved hand, as he stays in black, and you're not sure throughout the entirety of Return of the Jedi what way he's actually going to go. In fact, at some points, it seems like he might turn to the dark side like his father did. We are meant to believe this, but of course that breaks for us. And in the end, when he comes out with the goodness, he rejects killing Darth Vader in maybe the most important entire movie. Sorry if it's spoilers. The movies are really old though, so probably should watch them. We see his little flap of clothing gives way to show that he's still that farm boy. The goodness of the character is still underneath them, even as he's transcended into becoming a full Jedi. These are the details that clothing and color and all this detailing and costuming can give us. So I'll show you now in the next one how we make some of this clothing inside a blender.